Now let's step back in time to the year 1620. We're here in Plymouth, Massachusetts for Chapter 1 of our series, A World Forged in Fire. The air is crisp and cool, a gentle breeze rustling through the scarlet and gold hues of 1,000 maples. Overhead, the sky is a perfect dome of azure, dotted with clouds like puffs of spun sugar. All around you, the peace of a New England autumn morning reigns supreme. The scent of decaying leaves mingles with the tang of the sea, carried aloft by the wind from the nearby harbor. Somewhere in the distance, a lone church bell tolls, announcing the quiet majesty of a day untroubled by strife. It is a moment suspended in time, a tableau of tranquility that seems almost timeless. But this placid scene, like all moments in human history, is poised on the threshold of change, for within this tranquil vista, there are signs of life stirring, of destinies about to intertwine. The tranquility of this morning at Plymouth in October 1620 is about to be transformed into a crucible of cultural exchange, a pivotal moment that would echo through the ages, as the Mayflower, laden with dreams and trepidation, begins its slow journey towards this very shore, carrying with it the first English settlers to brave the wilds of this new world. Let's pause for a moment and take stock of our surroundings. This place we find ourselves in is more than just a geographical location. It's a stage set for one of the most significant chapters in world history. The Mayflower, with its precious cargo of pilgrims, is not just a ship, it's a vessel of change, carrying with it seeds of culture, religion and governance that will shape the course of 2 continents. Our story today isn't confined to these shores. It's a tale that resonates across oceans, touching upon the very essence of human migration, exploration, and the relentless march of progress. Across the vast expanse of our planet, from the sun-drenched fields of Europe to the untamed wilderness of North America, the spirit of adventure and discovery is alive and well. Today, we stand on the threshold of a grand narrative that will unfurl before us over many chapters. But before we set sail on this epic journey, let's take a moment to appreciate the significance of where we are. Here in Plymouth, we're at the cusp of a new era, an era that will redefine the boundaries of exploration, challenge the norms of societal norms, and rewrite the very definition of cultural exchange. But let's not dwell too much in the future yet. Let's savor the present. Let's breathe in the crisp autumn air, feel the crunch of fallen leaves beneath our feet, and listen to the symphony of birdsong and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. For in this moment of tranquility, we're truly alive, experiencing the beauty of a world on the brink of extraordinary transformations. This idyllic setting of Plymouth in the year 1620 serves as the backdrop for a tale of cultural fusion and resilience, a testament to the indomitable spirit of human exploration and adaptation. Imagine yourself here, in this bucolic landscape, where rolling hills meet the sea and the air is alive with the promise of a new world. It's a setting that's both enchanting and daunting, much like the journey that lies ahead for our pilgrim settlers. As the Mayflower approaches, the sight that greets them is one of both wonder and uncertainty. On one hand, there's the allure of a land seemingly untouched by the grime and chaos of old-world Europe, offering a canvas of opportunity and fresh beginnings. On the other hand, there's the stark reality of an alien landscape, a dense, dark forest, teeming with unknown creatures, and fraught with challenges that test the limits of human endurance. In the heart of this untamed wilderness, amidst towering trees and undergrowth carpeted with fallen leaves, lies a world vastly different from the one our settlers are accustomed to. The sounds of the forest are a haunting melody, the rustling of leaves, the chatter of squirrels, and the distant call of an owl, creating an atmosphere that's at once beautiful and eerie. Then there are the sights that assault their senses, the play of light and shadow through the canopy, the vibrant tapestry of fall colors, and the intoxicating scent of pine and damp earth that permeates the air. And then one comes across the enigmatic Native Americans, a people as alien to our settlers as they are familiar with this land. Their attire, customs, and language are a complete enigma, creating an atmosphere of cultural collision that's both intriguing and intimidating. Over the next few chapters, we'll delve deeper into this rich tapestry of sights, sounds, and encounters, exploring the intricacies of daily life in 17th century New England. But for now, let's bask in the grandeur of this setting, understanding that every leaf that crunches, every bird that takes flight, and every whisper of wind through the trees is a brushstroke in the masterpiece that is early American history. Before we proceed, let us turn our attention to a key element that has been integral to civilizations throughout history: agriculture. Now picture this: you're standing in a clearing, the bustling center of your pilgrim settlement. Before you stretches a vast tract of land just waiting to be tamed and cultivated. It's a blank canvas upon which the settlers are about to paint their hopes and dreams, one harvest at a time. Here, in the fertile lands of 17th century New England, the cycle of planting, nurturing, and reaping is more than just a means of sustenance. It's a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. The soil, rich and awaiting their touch, becomes a metaphor for the potential that lies dormant, just waiting to be unlocked. As the settlers break ground, they're not just tilling the soil, they're tilling the very fabric of their new lives. Each furrow is a commitment to their new home, each seed a prayer for a bountiful future. The process of sowing and harvesting becomes a communal activity, binding the settlers together in a shared purpose. It's a dance between man and nature, a partnership that ensures survival and paves the way for prosperity. As the seasons turn and the crops begin to yield, a sense of accomplishment washes over the settlers. The harvest, a rich tapestry of colors and textures, becomes a symbol of their enduring spirit. From the golden wheat to the plump pumpkins, each fruit of their labor tells a story of struggle and triumph. More than just food, the bounty of the harvest becomes the cornerstone of community, shaping the social fabric of the settlement. The act of sharing the harvest strengthens bonds, fostering a sense of unity and interdependence among the settlers. In the midst of this agricultural rhythm, the settlers don't just survive, they thrive. They adapt, innovate, and persevere, turning the challenges of this new land into opportunities for growth and self-reliance. And as the years pass, the landscape itself bears witness to their tenacity, evolving alongside the settlers into a thriving testament to human enterprise. As the final rays of sunlight begin their descent, casting long shadows across the landscape, we find ourselves on the brink of a pivotal chapter in our narrative. The Pilgrims, after weeks at sea, are nearing the shores of Cape Cod, their hearts filled with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. For them, this journey is more than just a voyage across the Atlantic. It's a pilgrimage of faith, a quest for religious freedom in a new world. The Mayflower, their vessel, is not just a ship, it's a floating sanctuary, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of an entire community. Their route takes them through a sea that's as treacherous as it is vast, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of the natural world. Storms lash the ship, testing the limits of both human endurance and the sturdiness of their vessel. Yet, through it all, the Pilgrims hold fast to their purpose, their determination acting as an anchor in the tempestuous sea of uncertainty. Amidst the turmoil of the journey, there are moments of serenity, times when the wind subsides and the vast expanse of the ocean mirrors the boundless nature of their aspirations. These moments of calm serve as reminders of the beauty that exists even in the harshest of environments, offering glimpses of hope and tranquility amidst the relentless waves. The arrival off the coast of Cape Cod is a momentous occasion, marking the end of a perilous journey and the beginning of a new chapter in human history. As they set foot on this untamed land, the Pilgrims bring with them the seeds of a new society, one that will profoundly impact not just their own fates, but the course of 2 continents. The air is thick with anticipation as they disembark, each step echoing with the weight of the decisions that lie ahead. The Mayflower, having played its part in this great adventure, now recedes into the distance, leaving the Pilgrims on their own, in the heart of an unfamiliar wilderness. It's a scene that encapsulates the essence of exploration, the courage to venture into the unknown, the resilience to endure the hardships of the journey, and the vision to see beyond the immediate challenges to the boundless possibilities that lie ahead. Now we find ourselves in the heart of autumn 1620, standing on the threshold of a new world. The Mayflower, having braved the tempestuous seas, has finally reached the shores of Cape Cod, bringing with it the first English settlers eager to carve out a life in the untamed wilderness of North America. These intrepid explorers, driven by dreams of religious freedom and a life untethered by the constraints of Old World Europe, have braved the wrath of the Atlantic only to be greeted by a landscape both enchanting and daunting. As they set foot on this alien terrain, a profound silence envelops them, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves and the cry of distant birds. The dense forest, carpeted with crimson and gold hues, stretches before them, hiding countless secrets within its emerald depths. It's a realm where the laws of European custom hold no sway, where they are truly on their own, utterly reliant on their own wit and fortitude to survive. Through the veil of ancient trees, they catch glimpses of a terrain that's a far cry from the rolling hills and familiar landmarks of England. Winding rivers meander through valleys, reflecting the vibrant tapestry of the changing season. The very air is charged with a palpable energy, a potent blend of decay and renewal that speaks of nature's ceaseless cycle of life and rebirth. Emerging from the forest's embrace, the settlers are met with the panoramic vista of a coastline that seems to stretch endlessly towards the horizon. The vast expanse of the Atlantic shimmers in the distance, a constant reminder of the world they've left behind and the challenges that lie ahead. With each passing moment, the settlers find themselves enveloped in a world that's both captivating and intimidating. It's a world where the rules of their familiar existence are suspended, replaced by the primal laws of survival and adaptation. Yet amidst the uncertainty, there's an undercurrent of excitement, a shared understanding that they're not merely explorers, but pioneers, on the cusp of creating a new life, a new society, and a new future. As we navigate this uncharted territory alongside the Pilgrims, one thing becomes abundantly clear. This is not just a journey of exploration, it's a journey of self-discovery, a testament to the human spirit as insatiable curiosity and its capacity for resilience in the face of the unknown. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Chapter 1 of our series, A World Forged in Fire. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to be part of our upcoming adventures, don't forget to subscribe for updates, and if you'd like to support our work, consider becoming a member. Your support allows us to continue crafting immersive historical journeys for you. Until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and remember, history is more than just dates and facts. It's a living, breathing tapestry of human experience. In the last chapter, we saw how England, as growing population and expanding empire around the world, were creating more opportunities for those seeking wealth and land. But it wasn't only economic opportunity that drew people out of England. Persecution for matters of conscience also played a big part in attracting immigrants to the New World. And nowhere is that clearer than with the story of the Pilgrims, who are often mistakenly called the Puritans. The two groups are closely related, but they are not the same. The Puritans were mostly members of the Church of England, who wanted to purify the Church of what they considered to be Catholic or corrupting influences. They didn't want to separate from the Church, but rather reform it. Some Puritans did come to the New World, but most stayed in England and fought for reforms within the established Church. The Pilgrims, on the other hand, were called separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England entirely. They believed that the Church was too corrupt to be reformed and withdrew from it. This put them at odds with the English government, which considered them a threat to the established order. And so began the long and dramatic tale of the Pilgrims and their journey to the New World. Our story begins in the town of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire, England, where a group of devout Protestants had been meeting in secret for several years, led by a man named John Robinson. These separatists worshipped in barns and private homes to avoid the attention of the authorities. For them, separation from the Church of England was a matter of conscience, and they would not compromise. In 1608, an English nobleman discovered their secret meetings and informed the local magistrates. Soon the separatists were being raided and arrested for illegal gatherings, and the threat of execution hung over them. So in the dead of night, they fled to the nearby town of Lincoln and waited anxiously for a way out of England. Meanwhile, across the ocean, a group of merchants and financiers in London had founded a new company called the Virginia Company of Plymouth, with the goal of establishing a settlement in North America. The company was granted a charter by King James I of England, who hoped that the colony would become a source of wealth and power for the kingdom. But the Virginia Company soon encountered problems. The location they had chosen for their settlement was not suitable for agriculture, and the harsh climate made it difficult for the colonists to survive. As the colony struggled to stay alive, the company looked for ways to make money and came up with a radical idea: transporting prisoners to the colony as indentured servants. This was a risky move, but it was one that the king approved of, as it provided an inexpensive way to staff the colony and get rid of some of England's growing population of criminals. Among the first prisoners sent to the colony was a man named John Alden, who would later become a key figure in the Pilgrims' journey to America. Back in England, the separatists in Lincoln heard rumors of the colony in Virginia and saw an opportunity to escape persecution and build a new life in freedom. But there was one problem. They didn't have much money. Becoming an indentured servant meant giving up your freedom for a set period of time in exchange for transportation to the New World. Most of the separatists were poor and couldn't afford to pay for their passage, but they had one thing that was even more valuable: their faith. The separatists reached out to the Virginia Company and struck a deal. In exchange for agreeing to become indentured servants, they would be freed from their contracts after only 7 years instead of the usual 14. The company saw this as a good deal, as they needed labor more than they needed money, and so the Pilgrims prepared for their journey across the Atlantic. They knew that they were leaving behind everything they had ever known and loved, but they were also excited to start a new life in a new land. There was just one small problem. None of them had ever been on a boat before. The Pilgrims arrived at the port of Southampton in the spring of 1620, with high hopes and little money. They boarded the Mayflower, a small merchant ship that was not designed for long sea voyages. It was cramped and dirty, and there was no room for privacy. The Pilgrims were packed in with the ship's crew and the animals they had brought with them, including livestock and dogs. Conditions on the ship were terrible. There was no fresh air, and the toilets were simply buckets that were emptied out of the side of the ship. The Pilgrims were constantly at risk of disease and infection. But perhaps the worst part of the journey was the food. The Pilgrims had brought enough food with them to last for the entire voyage, but they had underestimated the length of the journey and soon ran out of supplies. They were forced to eat only one meal a day, and many of them became severely malnourished. But despite the hardships, the Pilgrims pressed on. They knew that they were on a mission from God, and that their destination was worth the sacrifice. After a long and arduous journey, the Mayflower finally reached the coast of what is now Massachusetts. The Pilgrims were exhausted and in poor condition, but they were also excited to see what their new home had in store for them. It's important to remember that when the Mayflower arrived, it wasn't exactly greeted with a sign that said "Welcome to America." The land the Pilgrims landed on was inhabited by Native Americans who had been living there for thousands of years. We don't know much about the Native Americans who first encountered the Pilgrims, because their oral histories and languages were not written down. However, historians believe that they belonged to the Wampanoag tribe. According to the History.com website, Massasoit was the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, a group of 8 to 12 tribes in southern New England. When Massasoit first saw the Mayflower, he assumed it was a friendly trading vessel, because European ships were common in the region. However, when the men on board came ashore, Massasoit grew suspicious. Fortunately, a Native American named Squanto, who had lived in England for several years, acted as an interpreter between the Pilgrims and Massasoit. Squanto explained to Massasoit that the Pilgrims were not traders, but a group of English religious refugees who wanted to settle in the New World. Massasoit was skeptical, but he agreed to meet with the Pilgrim leaders. The meeting between Massasoit and the Pilgrim leaders was an important moment in history. It was the first time that an English-speaking European and Native Americans had met. We don't know exactly what was said at the meeting, but we do know that Massasoit was impressed by the Pilgrims' story and agreed to allow them to settle in his territory. He also helped the Pilgrims survive their first winter in the New World by teaching them how to grow corn and catch fish. These early interactions between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans were relatively peaceful. However, tensions would eventually rise, leading to conflict and war between the two groups. And so the Mayflower had landed in what is now Massachusetts. But where exactly did they land? Well, that's a bit of a mystery. The exact location of the Mayflower landing is not known, but it is believed to have been somewhere in the general area of Cape Cod. The Mayflower carried 51 passengers who had paid to be transported to the New World. Among them were 33 members of the Pilgrim congregation, including John Alden, John Carver, William Brewster, Isaac Allerton, Miles Standish, and John Howland. There were also 18 crew members who had been hired to sail the ship and then returned to England. And finally, there was one servant, John Robinson, who had been brought on board by the crew. After sailing across the Atlantic Ocean for 66 days, the Mayflower finally reached the coast of New England on November 1620. The passengers were eager to explore their new surroundings and establish a new settlement in this unfamiliar land. As the Mayflower approached the coast, the passengers began to explore the area. They were awestruck by the beauty of the land and the abundance of wildlife. But they also realized that they were in a wild and unknown territory. The passengers knew that they were in for a long and difficult journey, but they were also excited to begin their new lives in this new and uncharted territory. And so, the Mayflower had finally reached the shores of New England, carrying with her a group of pilgrims who would go on to become one of the most iconic groups in American history. But what happened next? How did the Pilgrims survive their first winter in this unfamiliar land? And what challenges did they face as they tried to establish their colony? Stay tuned to find out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing for more historical tales. See you next time. Chapter 3: The Harsh First Winter. A cannon shot cracked like a whip through the frosty air. The Mayflower had come to rest. It was November now, 1620, and most of the men were ashore. There would be no more sailing for them until the spring. But while they unloaded the ship, 2 men stayed behind. One was the captain, Christopher Jones, who sailed the Mayflower back across the Atlantic, and the other was John Howland, who opted to stay with the ship rather than walk ashore into the unknown. As far as we know, these 2 men would be the last to join the growing community, bringing its total number to 51. And from this point forward, their struggle was just beginning. To make matters worse, there would be no celebration of Christmas either. On that day, Governor Carver called for a fast and a prayer, confessing that they'd had little cause for joy or mirth since their arrival, and their first winter in New England was to be a season of bitter cold, sickness, and death. On one of the colder days, Edward Winslow wrote to a friend in England about the harsh conditions they faced. He described how icy the weather had become, that though the sun shone brightly, it gave no warmth, and he mentioned how the people of the colony were much afflicted with sickness, and that many of them were at the point of death. By December, the colony had been struck by what we would call the flu, although in those days it was known simply as a fever, and some have speculated that it may have been bubonic plague. Whatever the case, it caused high fevers, extreme weakness, and aching limbs, and it claimed many victims. Over the course of the winter, at least 20 of the 51 colonists died, including John Howland, who'd elected to stay behind with the ship. In his journal, William Bradford wrote that Howland lay sick only for days and then he died. Later, he would write about another death, that of a man named James Rowe, whose wife had died in childbirth, and who, after burying her, was seized with an intense fever and died the same day. Even Bradford himself would fall grievously ill, and his wife Dorothy would nurse him back to health. Of her, Bradford would say that she tended upon me day and night, most patiently and carefully till I was well. These things being done with a strong hand and cheerful countenance, did much encourage me and others that were sometimes ready to give up hope. But these deaths were not the only hardships that the colonists endured that winter. Another danger stalked their settlement, one that stalked in the night. Storms raged, winds blew, and snow piled up, creating drifts as high as men were tall. Beneath the cover of darkness, monstrous shapes seemed to rise up out of the swirling snow. The colonists had been warned about such dangers by the Native Americans they'd encountered before the winter set in, and they knew that they must guard against the winter's tooth, as one man put it. So every evening, after the last rays of sun had faded away and the howling winds had begun to moan, sentries would take their places, armed with nothing more than sharp stakes and their own courage, to stand against the cold and whatever else might come. By January, the temperatures had fallen to below zero. Frostbite and gangrenous wounds became common, and one man, Richard Warren, cut off his own dead fingers. Perhaps the hardest thing for the survivors to bear was the relentless monotony of the days. Each one was filled with the same bleakness, the endless flurry of snow, the piercing wind, the gloom that fell at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They observed Christmas, of course, and Christmas only reminded them of what they'd lost. After all, Christmas is a holiday about family and friends, and so many of theirs were gone. They buried them under the snow, each mound a silent reproach. The few remaining men grew weaker and thinner. The meager stores of food that had arrived with the Mayflower were nearly exhausted. By late January, they were reduced to eating fish, shellfish, and the meager produce they could grow indoors in their garden beds. The threat of starvation loomed constantly before them. One morning, Edward Winslow awoke and felt too weak to get out of bed. In his journal, he wrote of the sorry pass he was in. He said, "Neither could I nor any of our company expect much remedy at our hands, for we had little or no store left, but a can of small beer, a little oil, some bread, a little meal, and a bit of cheese. No flesh nor fowl, nor any store of good worth a rush, nor yet any hopes of relief, for no ship could come at that season. Still, life went on. The temperature climbed above freezing occasionally, and the colonists used those times to venture outside and chop wood and tend to their gardens. And always, they watched the skies for a sign of the return of the Mayflower. Their fate depended on it. Finally, on February, after 4 long months, a faint speck appeared on the horizon. At first, they thought it might be a whale. Then they saw that it was a boat. It was being pulled by 2 horses. And on shore, the colonists ran and waved their arms until the boat reached them. On board was Captain Jones, who came to tell them that the Mayflower was anchored offshore and would be in soon. Overjoyed, the colonists gathered around Captain Jones, asking him if he brought any relief. He answered that he did. He said that the Mayflower had brought over 34 barrels of corn, 3 barrels of peas, 2 barrels of rye, a barrel of pork, and 2 barrels of fish. This food, along with the supplies that would arrive with the next ship, would save the colony from starvation. But unfortunately, it would also sow the seeds of discord among them. You see, when the Mayflower finally returned to Plymouth, it was under the control of a new governor, John Carver. He'd been chosen to replace William Bradford, who'd proven himself to be a capable leader, but who was unpopular among the merchants in England because he refused to participate in their fur trade. Carver, on the other hand, was eager to work with the merchants, and so, once he took charge of the colony, he ordered the hunters to kill as many deer as possible and to preserve their meat and hides. The merchants wanted the hides for their fur, of course, and the venison could be sold for profit. And this order was music to the ears of those colonists, who'd gotten rich trapping animals and selling their pelts. But the others, like William Bradford, opposed the order. They pointed out that the colony's first priority should be to build up a food supply. They didn't want to end up in a situation where they needed to sell their food to stay alive. Still, the split in the colony deepened and resentment grew. Eventually, the disagreements would blow over, but in the meantime, the colonists pressed on, preparing their settlement for the coming summer. They planted crops. They built more houses. And by the time the Mayflower returned again in the following year, bringing more settlers and supplies, they had managed to pull themselves together, and they welcomed the newcomers as friends and neighbors. In the years that followed, many more ships arrived and many more people came to live in Plymouth. Among them were a group of 15 young men, who'd been specifically sent to assist the colony in building more houses and other structures. Among them was a young man named John Alden, who would play an important part in the story. But that's a story for another time. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider subscribing. Also, if you'd like to learn more about the Mayflower, I've included links to my sources in the description below. Until next time, remember, stay curious. May 21st, 1620. The Mayflower arrives in Cape Cod Bay, and we have ourselves a situation. The Pilgrims are desperate for food, and the nearest people who could help them are thousands of miles away. That's right, we're about to meet some natives. Welcome to the first episode of a series about the Pilgrims. Chapter 4, Meeting the Wampanoag. So, if you've been paying attention, you may be wondering why the Pilgrims didn't just head south to meet up with the Spanish or French settlers. And that is because there weren't any. The closest Europeans were more than 3,000 miles away in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. See, this part of the world had actually been uninhabited by Europeans for several hundred years. You see, when Henry Hudson sailed into New England in 1609, he was looking for a sea route to the Pacific Ocean, but found nothing but rocks and ice. So when the English decided they wanted to establish a colony, they chose a spot in present-day Maine. They called it Popham, and it was abandoned after just 1 year due to harsh conditions and a mosquito-borne disease called malaria. After that, no English people returned to New England for another 10 years. During that time, a few French fishermen did show up, but they didn't stay long either. So when the Mayflower arrived carrying 51 English settlers, they were the first people of European descent to set foot in New England in over a decade. Now, the land they landed on was inhabited by a Native American tribe known as the Wampanoag, a term which actually encompassed many different Algonquian-speaking tribes. The Wampanoag people had lived in New England for thousands of years. During the first week of November, the Wampanoag men were out hunting when they spotted something strange on the beach. At first, they thought it was a boat, but as they got closer, they realized that it was a large wooden structure on wheels. The men hid in the trees and watched as strange men emerged from the ship and began to explore the shore. One brave soul even approached the ship, and when the men inside saw him, they yelled and made threatening gestures. The native man ran back to his friends, and together they decided to leave the newcomers alone for the time being. These first encounters between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims are often portrayed as peaceful and friendly. But as you can imagine, both sides were very cautious during these first meetings. Neither group knew anything about the other, and so each tried to learn as much as possible while avoiding any conflict. The English had brought with them an interpreter named John Alleyne, who had some experience with the natives further south. He would later become famous for translating the Bible into the language of the Narragansett tribe, and it was through him that the Wampanoag learned the English word for peace, which they adopted as part of their own language, calling it Panodimig, or man who has come in peace. But although the Pilgrims had an interpreter, the Wampanoag did not. The language barrier made communication difficult, and so it took months for a real understanding to develop between the two groups. Much of the early interaction was done through sign language, and it wasn't until the following spring that the first Wampanoag English dictionary was created. The Wampanoag men who first encountered the Pilgrims were Massasoit's scouts, and within a month, the two groups met face to face. Now Massasoit was the sachem, or leader, of the Wampanoag, and he was interested in learning all that he could about the newcomers. It's important to remember that, to the Wampanoag, the Pilgrims weren't even people. They didn't know what to make of these strange, pale-skinned men with their funny clothes and even funnier ways. In fact, the word the Wampanoag used to describe the Pilgrims literally meant people who came in a strange boat. But despite the fact that neither group fully understood what was going on, Massasoit was willing to take a chance on these new arrivals. He figured he had nothing to lose by befriending them, but everything to gain. He needed all the allies he could get to protect his people from the growing threat of the Dutch and English colonists to the north. And so he invited the Pilgrims to attend a great feast, and they accepted. This meeting is often called the First Thanksgiving, and it's said that 90 Wampanoag attended, including 80 warriors. This must have been quite a sight to behold, as the English were still wearing their travel clothes, and the natives were painted and feathered for war. But despite their differences, they managed to communicate well enough to form an alliance. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims how to cultivate the land, and provided them with food and other necessities. In exchange, the Pilgrims taught the Wampanoag how to use firearms, which were a great improvement over the bows and arrows the natives had been using up until this point. But despite this uneasy alliance, the Wampanoag were suspicious of the English. They knew that the Spanish and French explorers had nearly always been hostile towards the natives, and they had good reason to think that the Pilgrims were the same. In fact, just a few weeks after the treaty was signed, a group of armed English soldiers showed up at a native village demanding that the Wampanoag hand over their guns. The natives refused, and so the English took it upon themselves to confiscate the weapons by force. This incident almost led to war, but Massasoit managed to calm things down by pointing out that the treaty specifically stated that the Wampanoag were allowed to keep their possessions. Realizing that they had made a mistake, the English apologized and gave the natives compensation for their guns. Tensions were high after this, and it seemed as though war might break out at any moment. But both sides wanted to avoid that, and so they held off. The next year, though, things would come to a head. As the English colonists grew bolder, they began to encroach on Wampanoag territory. In 1622, they even arrested 2 natives for trespassing. When Massasoit heard about this, he was furious, and he immediately assembled his warriors. But before he could do anything, he fell ill and died. His son, Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, took over as sachem, and he continued his father's policy of trying to coexist with the English. But not all of the Wampanoag were happy with this arrangement. Many wanted revenge against the English for taking their land and oppressing their people. And when Metacomet took his father's life in 1627, those people were ready to fight. Over the next few years, the Wampanoag would wage war against the English, and it would be brutal. But that is a story for another time. To learn more about the Wampanoag people, check out the additional resources, and to learn what happened next, stay tuned for Chapter 5. See you soon. Alright, let's get back to Chapter 5 of our series, where we meet Squanto. Now, if you're new to this series, then welcome aboard. We're traveling through time and space to explore how people have farmed, hunted, and fished throughout history. And there are lots of stories that go with the food history. So if you like to eat and learn about cool stuff, consider subscribing because it really helps us out. Now, in Chapter 5, we're exploring the intersection of Native American history with European colonization. This is a complicated topic, and it's one that I feel like we need to discuss more on this channel. But for today, we're going to focus on one man named Squanto. His story is pretty incredible, and as far as I can tell, he was probably the most well-traveled Native American of his time. He was kidnapped by Europeans, traveled all over Europe, learned several languages, returned to North America, and then helped the very people who had kidnapped him survive. And he did all of this before most people in the United States were born. This is a lot to unpack, and we try to do it in less than 10 minutes, so let's do it. Squanto was born around 1595 in what is now Massachusetts. He was part of a group of Native Americans known as the Patuxet, which means people of the sunrise. And when he was a kid, his village was attacked by another Native American tribe, the Pequot. They killed almost everyone in his village and took Squanto and some other kids captive. The Pequots marched their captives south to a place called Block Island, which is just off the coast of Rhode Island. Then they put Squanto on a ship bound for Spain. He was only about 12 or 13 years old. There's not a whole lot of historical documentation from this point, but we think Squanto spent some time living with the Spanish and then the Portuguese, and during this time, he picked up several languages along the way. For instance, he learned English from the English fishermen who came to New England every year to fish. He learned Spanish and Portuguese from his captors, and we know that he knew Dutch when he returned to New England, because he actually lived briefly among the Dutch colony at Fort Orange, which is present-day Albany, New York. But how did he get back to New England? Well, that part of his story is a little murky. Some historians say he simply got tired of living among the Dutch and walked back to New England. Other historians say he was actually sent back by the Dutch as a spy. Either way, he ended up back in New England, speaking a bunch of different languages and having a really unique perspective on the world. When he returned to New England, Squanto probably didn't speak any Patuxet anymore, and his own people, the Patuxet, were basically gone. The English colonists who arrived in 1620 would later write that Squanto was one of only 2 survivors of his tribe. But I don't really trust that, because we know for a fact that there were other Native American tribes in the area. But Squanto did probably face a lot of prejudice from those tribes, since he looked different and had a hard time speaking their language. But fortunately, Squanto met a guy named Isaac Allerton. Now, Allerton was one of the original 51 English settlers who survived the Mayflower voyage, and he was basically adopted by Squanto's friend Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag tribe. And through Massasoit, Squanto was able to reconnect with his roots and learn about the land and its bounty. According to the colonists, Squanto taught them how to plant corn, catch fish with nets made of cedar branches, and collect food during different seasons. In particular, the colonists were pretty bad at collecting food during the winter, and Squanto showed them how to harvest shellfish and dig 4 tubers called Jerusalem artichokes. And he also showed them how to tap maple trees for their sap and preserve it for eating during the winter. Now, this is an interesting point, because the English colonists were used to getting a lot of their calories from meat. But as the author of Plymouth Plantation wrote, the Indians showed us how to take the small fish which swarm in our rivers, and by drying and powdering them, make a convenient and wholesome diet for man and beast. This is an interesting cultural shift, because when the Pilgrims first arrived, they didn't think much of eating fish. Now, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows between the colonists and the Native Americans. There was definitely a lot of tension. And there was even a war between the colonists and a different Native American tribe called the Narragansett. But Squanto's friend Massasoit helped keep the peace. And here's where things get weird. In 1623, Massasoit got sick, and he asked Squanto and another interpreter named John Danforth to come help him. According to a letter written by John Winthrop, Squanto spoke with Massasoit's tribe in the Patuxet language, and this makes me wonder if the Patuxet weren't totally wiped out, as the English colonists believed. Anyway, Squanto visited Massasoit every day while he was sick and apparently helped nurse him back to health. But after Massasoit recovered, he died a few months later. And once again, Squanto helped ease the tension between the colonists and the Wampanoag by asking forgiveness for the things that happened after Massasoit's death. Squanto continued to act as a mediator between the two groups until his death in 1670. During this time, he helped negotiate treaties, mediate conflicts, and teach the colonists how to live in this new land. But he also worked as an explorer, a hunter, and a farmer. And we don't really know much about these aspects of his life, except that he probably had a farm near the settlement of Plymouth. In fact, there is a pretty great story about Squanto and his farm that shows how well he adapted to this new world. So one day, Squanto was plowing his field and he came across a buried pot of gold. And instead of keeping the gold, he called the English governor over so they could divide it up according to English law. That might sound stupid, but remember, Squanto had been kidnapped as a young boy and sold into slavery. He knew firsthand what it was like to be dominated and exploited by Europeans. And maybe he didn't want his newfound freedom to be taken away. Maybe he wanted to integrate into the culture that had adopted him. Either way, Squanto's life is an amazing story of resilience, adaptation, and cultural exchange. I mean, he went from being a victim of the very people he was helping to a respected member of the community. But there's a lot more to his story than that. And honestly, I could talk about it for days. But to wrap this video up, let's think about Squanto's legacy. He's remembered as the man who taught the Pilgrims how to survive in the New World. But he was more than that. He was a teacher, a diplomat, and a bridge between two cultures. He helped open the door for peaceful relations between the colonists and the Native Americans, and without him, who knows what would have happened. You know, I am kind of curious if Squanto would have preferred to live among the Native Americans or the colonists. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. For me, Squanto represents the best and worst of European colonization. On the one hand, he was kidnapped and exploited, but on the other hand, he was able to use his experiences to help others. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new. Now, if you want to learn more about the history of food, farming, and fishing, you can subscribe to our channel or check out our website. We've got tons of cool stuff there, including an online store where you can buy our coffee. All the proceeds from our coffee go directly to the production of this series. If you want to support our work, you can also check out our Patreon page. Well, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy farming, fishing, and foraging. Now, when April had passed, half of May had passed, and still there was no sign of spring. But the last few days, the weather had turned mild, and they were hoping for some warmer temperatures. And then one morning in early June, William Brewster, who is known as one of the more gloomy and somber of the Pilgrims, he awoke with a start and shouted to his neighbor, "Come, come, 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 see what God has done this night." For overnight, their barren fields had sprouted green. It seemed that winter had fled and summer had sprung forth all in one night. They marveled at the transformation. The ground, which just days before had been hard and frozen, now soft and moist and full of promise. And so it was that the Pilgrims spent the rest of the week in great joy, planting their crops. Their leader Massasoit gave each family an assignment for their crops. Every family was to plant corn, and every family was to plant pumpkins, and every family was to plant barley. In addition, each family would also have their own small plot where they could plant whatever else they wanted, whether it be squash or beans or beets or carrots or onions. William Bradford, who had just been re-elected governor, he took his turn in the field and he wrote in his journal how pleasant it was to see the women and children running about the fields gathering sticks and stones, singing and talking and laughing. How unlike the bleak winter it had been. There was only one thing that would make it better, he said, and that would be if they could clear away all these trees and open up a wide field. But he knew that would take many years. As the days went by, the fields grew greener and the seedlings grew taller. Then came the weeding. Each day, everyone had to stop their work and pull weeds from the fields. This was particularly hard on the children. They hated pulling weeds. But their mother would tell them, "If you do not pull these weeds today, the birds will scatter the seeds and we will have even more weeds next week." So the children sighed and they pulled. In the middle of July, the barley was ripe for harvest. The men cut the grain with sharp sickles, while the women followed behind with their aprons tied around their heads, gathering the grain into bundles. Then they carried the bundles back to the fort and laid them in rows to dry. They gathered enough grain for seed, then they threshed the rest of it by stomping on it until the grain separated from the chaff. After that, they winnowed it by throwing it in the air to catch the wind that blew the chaff away. Finally, they ground the flour into meal with a hand mill. This was hard, tedious work. All of the families had to participate or they wouldn't have enough food to last the winter. August brought with it more rain and more heat and more work. Every day the men cleared more trees from the forest, built more houses for the growing community. The women cooked meals for everyone and sewed clothes for the cold weather. The children, well, the children ran through the fields gathering sticks and stones and digging for clams and mussels along the shore. They helped their parents prepare their crops and they looked after the animals. Then, toward the end of August, disaster struck. A great drought settled over New England. Day after day, the sun beat down on the fields, baking the soil and turning the once green stalks of corn brown and stiff. The river, which had been full and robust, began to dwindle and shrink. Soon, it was little more than a trickle. People began to panic. What would they eat? Would their children starve? Were they doomed to die in the wilderness after all? It was during this time that the Pilgrims' hope began to grow. 2, 4 slowly, surely, day by day, week by week, the mistrust between them and the Wampanoag was melting away. One day, Samoset had visited the Plymouth plantation, and ever since, there had been a steady stream of Wampanoag coming to trade with the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims traded things like knives and combs and scissors and kettles for things like dried fish and corn and furs, and they also shared stories. One day, 2 Wampanoag braves named Tisquanum and Witwamet, they sat with the Pilgrim leaders, and they told them, "You have a great hope that your corn will grow tall and produce an abundant harvest. But you seem to forget that there are thousands of us, the Wampanoag, and we have always grown corn here. We know the secrets of the soil, how to coax the corn to grow even in the harshest of times." And then they told the Pilgrims what they needed to do. "You must leave your corn alone. Do not harvest it until the leaves have turned yellow and withered and the kernels are hard and fully formed. Only then can you harvest it. Before then, it is the work of the deer and the wild turkeys and the bears and the raccoons." The Pilgrims listened carefully. They realized that without the Wampanoag, they might not survive this harsh wilderness, and they also realized that maybe, just maybe, the Wampanoag weren't as savage and uncivilized as they had thought. Maybe they were quite the opposite. While Tisquanum and Witwamet, they stayed for 3 weeks and taught the Pilgrims everything they knew about surviving in New England, how to trap animals and fish and gather food. And then when the 3 weeks had passed, and it was time for them to go, the Pilgrims asked, "Can we pay you for all your help? Can we give you something?" And the braves answered, "We do not need anything from you, but we would like to see your harvest, the harvest that we have helped you plant." So the Pilgrims agreed, and they invited the 2 braves to come back in the fall and bring their friends and enjoy the harvest feast. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew cooler, the tension eased in Plymouth. People felt safer. Children played freely. They sang songs as they worked, and they all looked forward to the bountiful harvest. And they looked forward to celebrating that harvest with their new friends, the Wampanoag. Then finally, in mid-September, after 3 long months, the corn was ready to harvest. They held a great celebration. All the families came together and they feasted on cornbread and succotash and roasted corn. Everyone helped gather and carry in the corn and then store it for the winter. When they counted it up, they found that they had more than enough to last them through the winter. After the harvest, they began to slaughter and salt the hogs and cattle for the winter. Governor Bradford noted that one hog weighed over 200 pounds. He also recorded that a deer had been sighted near the plantation and that his son-in-law had taken it with a musket. And so they were grateful for the bounty of the land, for the fish in the sea, and the fowl in the sky. A few days later, Tisquanum and Witwamet returned with about 90 other Wampanoag. They came bearing gifts of venison and fish and fowl. They joined the Pilgrims in feasting and celebration. They traded with them and they shared stories. And they made plans to hunt and fish and trap together. The Pilgrims were careful to show their gratitude to the Wampanoag for teaching them how to survive in the wilderness, and they were very happy to have such brave allies against the harsh environment. So that was Chapter 6, The Spring and Summer of 1621. How did you like it? Which part was your favorite? Tell me in the comments below, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. And if you have a good book you'd like to see us bring to the screen, let me know that too. Thank you so much for watching. Signing out, the air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was perfect weather for gathering crops, and for a change, it wasn't hot and humid like it had been for most of the summer. In the fields surrounding the settlement, the work continued at a frantic pace. Men, women, and children worked together, gathering in the last of the summer's bounty. Miles Standish stood proudly surveying his men as they cut down the tall cornstalks, gathered up the ripening beans, and picked the fat pumpkins and winter squash. They'd lost so much of their spring and summer crops to drought, disease, and hungry insects that he'd feared the worst. But now, looking out over the full and fruitful fields, he felt a swell of relief and happiness. It was truly a good day's work. Meanwhile, Governor Bradford, William Brewster, and John Howland were out hunting. They had had much luck in the spring or early summer when they'd gone on hunting trips. But now the woods teemed with game, fattened by the summer's growth and preparing for winter. Deer, wild turkeys, and other animals, unaware of the danger stalking them, moved through the forest undergrowth, completely unaware of the danger that stalked them. Within minutes, the hunters returned to the settlement, each with a deer slung over his shoulder. Other hunters arrived soon after, bringing with them more venison. And because some of the men had brought their dogs, they also returned with rabbits, which would stretch their food stores even further. As the week wore on, the settlers' relief grew. With all the wild game and an excellent harvest of corn, beans, and squash, they would have enough to eat through the winter and likely into the following year. Soon, every family had gathered in their crops, and the excitement began to build. What should they do to celebrate? Some wanted to hold a great feast. Others wanted to hold a prayer meeting. Still others wanted to do both. Finally, they agreed to hold a 3-day festival, which they would spend in giving thanks to God for sustaining them through such a difficult year, praying for the coming year, and celebrating with a great feast. On the morning of the first day of the festival, the settlers gathered together for a sunrise prayer meeting. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they broke into groups. The men went to work preparing the feast, while the women and children gathered flowers and greenery to decorate the tables and the governor's house. By midday, the feast was ready. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted venison, plump pumpkin, sweet potatoes, cornbread, succotash, cranberry sauce, and dozens of other dishes. Wild turkeys and ducks were prepared as well, along with fish caught in the nearby rivers and bay. Miles Standish carved the first slice of roasted venison and held it up for all to see. "Let us give thanks to the Lord, who has given us such a bountiful harvest and sustained us through this year of hardship," he said. And then everyone dug in. Over the next 3 days, the settlers ate, drank, sang, and danced. They invited the Native Americans who had helped them survive, and they shared stories, games, and songs. When the time came to parts, the Native Americans presented the colonists with a great white flag that had been decorated with images of deer and turkeys. "We are your friends," the flag proclaimed. "We come in peace." The settlers treasured the flag, which became known as the Mayflower flag, for many years, hanging it in the town hall and displaying it during festivals and celebrations. But not everyone was happy. Squanto watched from afar as the colonists celebrated, and a deep sadness fell over him. His people had shown the colonists how to plant corn, catch fish with nets and lines, and gather edible plants and herbs. He'd even helped them hunt wild turkeys and other animals. Yet the colonists did not remember what it was like when they first arrived, cold and hungry, and how the Native Americans had welcomed them, sharing their food and teaching them how to survive in the wilderness. In less than a year, they had forgotten all about it, and worse, they had begun to encroach upon the Native Americans' lands. Squat and his people would never forget what the colonists had done to them and their way of life. And he knew that someday it would come to an end, either with a treaty or with war. For now, though, he turned back to his village, hoping that one day the colonists would remember the friendship that had saved them. The next morning, the colonists awoke, feeling refreshed and renewed. After a long and difficult winter, spring had finally arrived. As the settlers got up, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks. On the ground in front of the Mayflower lay a large white flag, the one the Native Americans had given them the day before. But now it was covered with strange symbols and markings. When the colonists looked closer, they realized that the markings were of a bird that looked a lot like a wild turkey, and below the image were the words, "Beware of the turkey." At first, the colonists were confused. Then they realized what it meant. Squanto and the other Native Americans were warning them not to eat the very food they had given them as a gift. To the Native Americans, the wild turkey was a sacred animal, and they believed that the colonists had insulted them by eating it. The colonists were ashamed. They had not meant to disrespect the Native Americans. They had only been trying to celebrate their survival, but they knew that they had to do something to make amends. So they gathered together all of the remaining wild turkey and other game, and they prepared a feast for the Native Americans. Then they went to Squanto's village and presented the feast to him and his people. Squanto was pleased. He accepted the gift on behalf of his people, and he promised that they would not harm the colonists. But he warned them not to eat any more sacred animals. The colonists promised that they would never eat any part of a wild turkey again, and they kept their word. From that day forward, the colonists treated the Native Americans with respect, and they never forgot that they had almost started a war over a misunderstanding. The Mayflower flag, which had been a symbol of peace between the two cultures, was displayed in the town hall to remind them of what had happened. And every year they celebrated Thanksgiving to give thanks for their survival and to honor the Native Americans who had helped them. So ends Chapter 7 of the Pilgrim's Progress. Our hero still has many challenges to overcome before he can reach the Celestial City. But let us be thankful that we have made it this far on our journey with him. Let us also take a moment to consider what lessons we can learn from those who have gone before us. The Pilgrims were a people who had suffered great hardships. They had crossed the ocean in a cramped and disease-ridden ship. They had endured a harsh winter in which half of their company died. They had struggled to plant crops in a strange and unfamiliar land, but through it all, they had held on to their faith in God and to their hope for a better future. We can learn from the Pilgrims the importance of faith and hope, no matter how difficult our circumstances may be. The Pilgrims were also a people who had been welcomed and helped by those who had lived in this land before them. The Native Americans had taught the Pilgrims how to plant crops, how to hunt and fish, and how to live in harmony with the natural world. Yet, the Pilgrims had forgotten this important lesson, and they had begun to encroach upon the lands of the Native Americans. We can learn from the Pilgrims the importance of respecting and appreciating the cultures and traditions of those who have lived in this land before us. Finally, the Pilgrims were a people who had learned the importance of giving thanks for the blessings we receive. Every year, they set aside a day to give thanks for the harvest and for the many blessings they had received throughout the year. We can learn from the Pilgrims the importance of taking time to appreciate all the blessings we receive, big and small. As we come to the end of this chapter, let us remember the lessons the Pilgrims have taught us. Let us have faith and hope in our darkest moments. Let us respect and appreciate the cultures and traditions of those who have lived in this land before us. And let us take time to appreciate all the blessings we receive. If we do these things, we will be honoring the Pilgrims and their legacy. I'm sorry it's taken so long, but I wanted to make sure I got this right. I've been working on this adaptation of the Pilgrim's Progress for over a year now, and I'm so excited to finally share it with you. I think this story is more relevant today than ever before. We live in a time when it seems like everyone is in a hurry, and no one takes the time to appreciate the blessings they receive. I hope this story will remind all of us to slow down and appreciate all the good things in our lives. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. The Pilgrims were preparing to have their first Thanksgiving feast. They had chosen the men who would hunt the wildfowl, and they had assigned tasks to others, but something was missing. Who would they invite to this feast? We'll find out in Chapter 8, Invitations and Preparation, Part 2 of the Mayflower story. Now we've come to the place where everyone is getting ready for the big feast, but nobody's quite sure what to do or when it will be ready, and there are several reasons for that. But before we get into it, don't forget to hit the like button if you haven't already. It really helps us reach more history lovers like you. Also, stick around until the end of the video if you can. We have some exciting news to share with you. So let us go back to the Pilgrims and see how they handled all of these invitations and preparations for the Thanksgiving feast. The Pilgrim men had decided that they needed to invite the local Native Americans to their feast. After all, they had helped them survive, and they needed their friendship to continue to thrive in this new land. Plus, Thanksgiving was a religious holiday, and so sharing it with those who had helped them was a sign of gratitude for God as blessings. Now, inviting someone to your house was very important in Pilgrim culture. They would never just show up at someone's door without an invitation. In fact, even after they had established their friendship with the Wampanoag, the Pilgrims still considered them quite savage. However, since they knew that the Wampanoag people had helped them, they wanted to be respectful and hospitable towards them. So Edward Winslow was given the important task of extending the invitation to Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Winslow traveled by canoe up the Charles River to meet with Mass, and when he asked for an audience with the chief, a young man named Tisquanum stepped forward. He took Winslow to a council of about 90 Wampanoag men. At first, the Wampanoag were suspicious of the Pilgrims. After all, they had heard stories of the Mayflower and the strange people who had come off of it. But Tisquanum assured them that the Pilgrims meant them no harm, and that they only wished to be friends. And because of Tisquanum's assurance, the Wampanoag agreed to meet with the Pilgrims. When Winslow extended the invitation, Massasoit accepted it with one condition. He said that his men would arrive 3 days later, and he wanted the Pilgrims to prepare a great feast for them. Now, the Pilgrims were honored that the Wampanoag chief and his warriors had accepted their invitation. They knew that this was an important opportunity to build goodwill between the two cultures, so they worked hard to make sure that everything was perfect for their guests. But it wasn't easy. The Pilgrims had never hosted a feast like this before, and they weren't sure how to prepare for such a large group of people. Luckily, they had some help. The Wampano arrived just as promised, and with them, they brought a huge amount of venison, which was very important to them. Venison was a staple of the Wampanoag diet, and they often hunted deer for their meat. In fact, deer were so important to the Wampanoag that they even had a special ceremony for thanking the deer for giving its life so that the people could eat. In addition to the venison, the Wampanoag also brought other provisions, such as fish and corn. This was very helpful for the Pilgrims, as they were running low on food. The Pilgrims had been struggling to grow crops in the New World, and their supplies from England were running out. But with the help of the Wampanoag, they were able to put together a feast that would impress even the most discerning guest. The Wampanoag were very generous with their food, and they shared it freely with the Pilgrims. They also brought with them a young man who was skilled in hunting and fishing. His name was Tisquanum, and he became known as the man who taught the Pilgrims how to survive in the New World. Tisquanum taught the Pilgrims how to catch fish with nets and how to hunt wild fowl with bows and arrows. He also showed them how to gather food from the forest, such as berries and nuts. This was very important, as the Pilgrims were not used to foraging for food. They had relied on their supplies from England, but those were now running out. Tisquanum's help saved the Pilgrims from starvation and helped them to understand how to live off the land. As the Wampanoag prepared the meat for cooking, the Pilgrim women went into the forest to gather berries and nuts. They had seen the Wampanoag women doing this and knew that it was an important part of their culture. The women gathered blackberries, raspberries, and chestnuts, which they would use to make desserts for the feast. Meanwhile, the Pilgrim men were busy building a roasting pit. This was an important part of the preparation process, as it allowed them to cook the venison over a low heat for several hours. This would ensure that the meat was tender and juicy. On the second day, the Pilgrim men set out to catch wild fowl. They had seen the Wampanoag men using bows and arrows to hunt birds, and they knew that this was an important source of protein for their guests. The men were successful in their hunt and returned to the village with several wild turkeys, ducks, and geese. These birds would be roasted and served with the venison at the feast. On the third day, the men finished the roasting pit and the Wampanoag arrived with their feast. The Pilgrims were impressed by the amount of food that the Wampanoag had brought, and they knew that they had to do everything they could to make their guests feel welcome. As the Wampanoag set up their tents, the Pilgrim children were curious and excited. They had never seen so much activity in their little village, and they wanted to know more about their guests. Edward Winslow's wife, Rose, was in charge of welcoming the Wampanoag women and children. She gave them presents and showed them around the village. The Wampanoag women were impressed by the Pilgrims' hospitality, and they knew that they were in good hands. By the time the feast was ready, both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had a lot of food to share. The Pilgrims had roasted the venison in the pit, and it smelled delicious. They had also baked bread in their ovens, and it was golden and inviting. The Wampanoag had prepared their own dishes, and they had brought corn and fish to share. When all the food was laid out on tables, it was a feast fit for a king. There were platters of roasted venison, loaves of bread, bowls of corn, and baskets of fish. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag gathered around the tables and gave thanks for the bounty before them. After the prayer, the feasting began. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoag ate together, sharing stories and laughter. The children played while the adults talked, and everyone enjoyed the delicious food. The feast lasted for 3 days, and during that time, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag learned a lot about each other. They shared stories about their cultures, and they also learned about each other's food. The Wampanoag were impressed by the Pilgrim-esque bread, and the Pilgrims were amazed at the Wampanoag-esque corn dishes. By the end of the feast, Both groups had formed a bond that would last for years. And that's where we'll leave off for today. If you'd like to learn more about the Mayflower story, check out the series in the description below. Thanks for watching. And if you want to join us for Chapter 9, click the link on screen now. In this chapter, we are all invited to a 3-day feast where there is an abundance of everything, including 20 fattened deer. Join us as we explore the symbolism behind the overflowing table and what it means for the Wampanoag people. The feast had lasted 2 days. In fact, it was already the 3rd morning that our little band of pilgrims and the tribe of the Massachusetts or Wampanoag had met together at the great table under the spreading branches of the ancient oaks. Every day the table had been laden with more food than the foragers could possibly eat. There were bushels of chestnuts, baskets of blueberries, trays of sweet-smelling dried fish, and jugs of sparkling cider made from the sap of the maple trees. At midday, when the sun climbed highest in the sky, they feasted on cornmeal porridge, served piping hot in earthenware bowls so large that it took 4 men to carry them. The porridge would have been cooked in a big iron pot over a fire pit filled with glowing embers, seasoned with the fat of deer, which the foragers had hunted during the previous winter. Deer were plentiful, so there was enough meat for everyone, and though the pilgrims quickly learned not to waste any food, they could take only so much at each meal, and then the rest would be given to the others. Even after eating until their bellies ached and then some, there were always leftovers. So by the end of the 2nd day, there were 5 great kettles full of porridge remaining. It looked like the foragers would have to fast for a while, but fortunately, that would not be necessary. On the 3rd morning, before the sun had chased away the last traces of night, Squanto came running through the forest, his breath forming white clouds in the chill air. He told them that Massasoit, the sachem, or chief of the Wampanoag, wanted to see them and requested that they send a delegation to meet him at the riverbank. Our friend Squanto also told them that Massasoit wanted the men to bring their hunting knives and axes with them. All the pilgrims were wondering what was going on. Some thought that the chief had grown tired of their presence and wanted to drive them away. When Tisquantum heard their fears, he told them not to worry. He would go with them and make sure that nothing happened. While the others prepared themselves for the meeting, Tisquin went back to the village to tell Massasoit that the men would come, but that it would take them a while. Then, he returned to the pilgrims with an armload of dried fish, which he told them they must cook immediately and bring to the riverbank. They were to do this without asking any questions. After the food was ready, the men set out for the riverbank, their weapons at their sides and their eyes sharp and alert. It wasn't far to go, and soon they saw that something was waiting for them by the river. Their first surprise was that instead of 1 boat, as they had expected, there were 5. But the biggest surprise was what they saw inside the boats. In each boat sat a man, and each man held a hatchet in his hand. This meant only one thing. Each of the men in the boats was a sachem, or chief, from a different tribe. One of the men was the chief of the Nipmuc, another, the chief of the Nipmuc. Among them was the chief of the Cape Cod and the chief of Martha's Vineyard, but the men were too busy greeting their hosts with loud voices and bear hugs to pay much attention to the gifts of fish. Still, the pilgrims knew better than to make any moves against the guests. After all, they were outnumbered. So they split up the fish among the 7 canoes and rowed it back to shore. As they unloaded the fish, Massasoit stood up in his canoe and spoke to the pilgrims. He said that the other chiefs had come because they had heard about the feast that the pilgrims were having. They had come to ask if they could join the feast. In return, they had brought gifts for the pilgrims, gifts that would ensure the feast would never end. The pilgrims accepted the offer and welcomed the chiefs and their followers to join them at the table. After all, there was enough food for everyone. There were 20 fattened deer that had been killed especially for the feast, as well as plenty of wild fowl and shellfish. Pumpkins grew so wild in New England that the foragers hardly had to work for them. They simply picked them up as they walked through the fields. And so there were hundreds of pumpkins for the feast. When the men had finished unloading the fish and distributing the gifts, Massasoit asked them to show him their hunting knives and axes. He told them that these were the tools of the hunter and the woodman, tools used for survival and for providing food. These were the tools of men who worked hard and were not afraid of anything, but now they would put these tools aside. Now they would use something else. Massasoit then reached into his canoe and pulled out 5 long poles, each one as thick as a man's wrist and nearly as tall as a man himself. He handed 1 pole to each of the pilgrims and told them to hold it like a spear. This was a symbol of war, a symbol of strength and power. Then Massasoit did something that surprised the Pilgrims even more. He dropped his pole into the river. The other chiefs did the same. At first, the Pilgrims thought that this was a sign of aggression, that the natives were getting ready to attack them. But then Massasoit spoke again. He told the Pilgrims that by dropping their spears into the water, they were showing that they did not want to go to war. They were showing that they did not want to hurt anyone. They were showing that they were peaceful people. Then, it was time for the ceremony to begin. The Pilgrims held their poles aloft and shouted as loud as they could. Then they dropped their poles into the river and shouted again. And then, as if by magic, the poles were gone. They had disappeared beneath the surface of the water. The Pilgrims were stunned. Where had the poles gone? Had they really just vanished? Suddenly, Squanto emerged from the bushes. In his hand, he held a large net filled with fish. With a great flourish, he pulled the net out of the river and held it aloft for all to see. The fish flopped and splashed in the net, and the Pilgrims could hardly believe their eyes. It was as if the very river itself had given them a gift. And indeed it had, for, in the natives' culture, the river was considered a living being, a great mother who provided for her children. The ceremony was over. The men helped each other out of their canoes and then stood in a circle on the shore. Massasoit took a deer and cut it into 5 pieces, 1 piece for each of the chiefs and 1 piece for the Pilgrims. Then the men helped each other carry the deer to the great table under the spreading branches of the ancient oaks. When the men arrived at the table, they found that it was covered with even more food than before. There were dozens of pumpkins, each one bigger than a man's head, and inside each pumpkin were kernels of corn, so fresh and so sweet that the Pilgrims could eat them right away. There were also clams, mussels, and lobsters, all gathered by the women and children. Tisquanum had told them that the best way to cook the lobsters was to bury them in the ground with hot stones. They would steam for hours, and the result would be worth it. The men sat down to eat, and as they ate, they told stories of their travels. The natives told the Pilgrims how they had explored the coast in their canoes, and the Pilgrims told the natives about their long journey across the sea. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the men grew hungrier and hungrier, and when the feast was finally over, there was not a morsel of food left, not 1 scrap of meat, not 1 kernel of corn, not 1 drop of cider. The men were so full that they could eat no more, and so they lay down on the soft grass and fell asleep. When they woke up, they saw that the women and children had cleared away all the dishes and were playing games nearby. The men joined in the games, and soon everyone was laughing and having a good time. The foragers stayed at the riverbank for 3 days, and during that time, they feasted on the bounty of the land. They caught fish in the river and gathered fruit and vegetables in the fields. They hunted deer and wild fowl in the forest, and they picked up pumpkins as they walked along. The Pilgrims had brought tools with them from England, tools that the natives had never seen before. They showed the natives how to use the tools to build houses and plant crops. In return, the natives showed the Pilgrims how to use their bows and arrows to hunt, how to track animals through the forest, and how to find food and shelter in the wilderness. When it was time for the Pilgrims to leave, they were sad to part ways with their new friends, but they knew that they must go. They had a long journey ahead of them, and they needed to start soon. The Pilgrims said goodbye to Massasoit and the other chiefs, and then they turned and walked away from the riverbank. As they walked, they looked back. They wanted to get one last glimpse of the great table under the spreading branches of the ancient oaks. But the table was nowhere to be seen. In its place was a clearing, a place where the Pilgrims had feasted and made friends, a place where they had learned how to survive in the wilderness, a place where they had discovered the true meaning of friendship. So what does this story teach us about the Wampanoag people? First, we learn that they were very welcoming to the Pilgrims. Despite the fact that the Pilgrims were strangers, the Wampanoag were willing to share their food and their knowledge. Second, we learned that the Wampanoag were very generous. They did not hold back any of their food or their resources. They were willing to give the Pilgrims everything they needed to survive. Finally, we learned that the Wampanoag were very peaceful. Despite the fact that they were warriors, they were willing to put down their weapons and live in harmony with the Pilgrims. Now, it's your turn to share your thoughts. What did you think of this story? How do you think the Wampanoag people viewed the Pilgrims? Why do you think the Wampanoag were so welcoming, generous, and peaceful? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Chapter 10. Games, Diplomacy, and Bonds Forged. The noise of the crowd is deafening. Cheering, jeering, whistles, drums, the clash of steel. It's a cacophony of sound, but there's order to it, a rhythm to the chaos. And I love every second of it. I stand with my men, watching the fighters duke it out in the center of the courtyard. Our team has won the first 2 games, wrestling and sword fighting, and now we are about to face off against the orcs in archery. I see Finn, one of our best, take his place at the firing line. He's calm, focused. Beside him, Gruck, the orc captain, is equally still, his face impassive behind his helmet. This contest was the idea of Thorgath. We all thought he was mad, but the orc has a plan for everything. This competition, he says, will show us who among us are the best. And the best, he claimed, would get something very special, something that would help them even more. Then he had a wicked grin on his face and added, if they don't kill each other first. After 2 days of bloody battles, both sides are weary. There have been deaths, but not many. If this continues, Thorga might be right. Some of our best might not survive the rest of the competition. So far, we have won 3 games, the orcs, 2. Only one remains, the throwing contest. Each side will put up 4 of their strongest. The winner of this will be the overall champion. In the stands, I watch as the 4 men from my side throw their axes. The orcs will go next. The first 2 humans hit the target, but Grog, the dwarf, misses. Kelger, halfling rogue, steps up and hits the bull's eye. That means whoever from the orcs matches or beats Kelger's score wins the game. The orc steps up, throws, and misses. Next one steps up, throws, and hits the target, but not the bull's eye. The crowd cheers. The third orc looks grim, takes aim and throws. His axe buries itself deep in the wood just above Kelgar's score. I turn to Thorgath, surprised. Even he looks impressed. The fourth and last orc steps up, takes aim and throws. His axe strikes Kelgar's exactly in the center of the bull's eye. A hush falls over the crowd. The orc raises his arms in victory. Thorgath grins, as promised. He turns to the orc captain and calls out, Gruck, you have proven yourself the best among warriors today. Come forward. Gruck nods to me and the rest of my companions before leaving the courtyard. He comes back with a heavy wooden chest in his arms. It's locked, but Thorgith produces a key. Here, he says to Gruck, the prize for the best. The orc captain opens the chest and gasps. Inside is an enormous battle standard, bigger than a man, emblazoned with a snarling wolf's head. Truly the best will earn the fiercest prize, Thorgith says, grinning. A few minutes later, I find myself alone with Grug in the relative quiet of his tent. It's big enough to hold maybe 20 men, but only Gruck and I are inside. On one side is a crude table and chairs made from tree branches and bound animal skins. Opposite the door is a pile of furs for sleeping. To one side is a brazier filled with glowing embers. Opposite that is a rack of weapons, swords, axes, bows, quivers of arrows. In the middle of it all is Gruck. He sits on a chair, cleaning his axe with a small piece of cloth. He looks up as I enter, his face impassive, but I can hear the amusement in his voice when he speaks. So you wish to speak with Grug, little wolf? I sit down on one of the nearby tree stumps. It's about the games. You did well. We all did, Grug says, wiping his axe clean with the cloth. You were impressive. You almost beat me. Almost doesn't count, Grug says with a grunt. There were some good scores in the throwing contest. That was close. Grug nods toward the brazier. Can I offer you meat? Thank you. That would be good. While Grug prepares the meat, we eat in silence. As I do, I look around the tent. All these weapons must have been taken from the slain, the trophies of countless battles. What would it be like, I wonder, to fight alongside an orc? I know they're fierce fighters, disciplined, well organized, deadly in close quarters, masters of siegecraft. There's much we can learn from them, and I sense Gruck knows that. Finally, Gruck breaks the silence. My chieftain wants to talk with you. I know. I asked to meet with you first because there are things your chieftain should know. What are they? Things I heard from my scouts, from prisoners. Things that you may want to think about before going into any alliance talks. Gruck considers this. What are they? Well, first, I hear your war parties returning from raids with less and less booty. Your hunters must be bringing in less game. There are fewer animals in the forest than there once were. The forests are old and the animals breed fast, Gruck says. Not here, I say. They've gone. They've moved farther north where the forests are new and easier to hunt. Perhaps, Gruk says, unconvinced. And I hear that the humans are driving south. Many fled across the river, but many stayed behind to burn their villages rather than leave them to the orcs. That is their problem, Gruk says. Their fields are ours for the taking. Soon there will be no wolves to steal our kills. They will plant again come spring, and the harvest will grow. Unless, I say, you wipe out every last human in the territory, you will have to deal with them. Again, and again, and again. We will deal with them, Gruk says. Second thing, I hear that there are dwarves in the mountains. You have met with them, traded with them, fought with them. Yes, what do they say about the orcs? They speak highly of our strength and tenacity. But none will trade with us anymore. Why? Because we cannot keep to any bargain. We cheat, steal, and kill. Gruk stares into the flames. Even when we shake hands on a deal, by the time we finish trading, neither of us remembers what was said. Well, perhaps that is because the dwarves drink so much ale while they trade. Or, perhaps it is because you cheated them and they are done dealing with orcs. Gruk says nothing. There are others who won't deal with you either. Goblins, hobgoblins, giants, elves. Yes, even the elves. What do they say? They say you are a danger to all. No creature feels safe with orcs near. So when they have a choice, they prefer to deal with anyone else. Gruk stands up, grabs his axe and walks to the front of the tent, staring out into the night. We are strong, he says finally. Strong enough to smash any dwarf chain, any human wall, any elf spell, and yet none of those creatures are going extinct, I point out. Yet you are. Fewer and fewer orcs. Every year the clans get smaller. Gruk slowly turns back to me. We are orcs. We hate living under the same sky as other creatures. Are you saying we should beg for food and let others take what we want? I am saying you could learn something from the creatures you despise. Humans farm the land instead of burning it. Elves live in harmony with nature instead of killing every animal in the forest. Dwarves make deals and stick to them. Goblins hoard treasure, which just might come in handy when hard times come again. And the giants, well, they have a long memory, but they also know when they're outmatched and run away. Could you learn something from each of them? Perhaps you could have allies instead of enemies. Gruk doesn't reply. What else is there to say? For a long moment, we just stare at each other. Finally, Gruk sheaths his axe. Thank you, little wolf. Later, after talking with Thorgath, I return to my camp. The fighting is over, and tonight there is a celebration. There is a large fire in the center of the clearing, and around it are the men of my company and many orcs. We are drinking, eating, laughing, telling stories. It's almost like we are friends. One of the orcs stumbles over to me, holding a flagon of ale, for Gruk and the Green Horde. He yells, raising his drink, to Gruk and the Green Horde. I answer, clinking my tankard against his. I see Cat in the shadows watching me. She's leaning against a tree, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Did Gruk tell her what we talked about? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter. Tonight, we are celebrating. Then, as suddenly as it began, the merriment ends. The orcs and my men fall silent, staring at the ground, each thinking his own thoughts. After a moment, I break the silence. Tomorrow, we begin the alliance talks. Hopefully it goes well. Hopefully, says Torag, coming to stand beside me. But if it does, we may have a lot of explaining to do. It's not normal for orcs and humans to be on good terms, especially not after all the fighting we've done, I say. But sometimes it's better to have an uneasy peace with an orc than war with one. Torga nods slowly. Very wise, little wolf. The alliance talks continue for 5 days. There are moments of anger, but for the most part, we discuss strategy, tactics, even training together. We exchange prisoners and wounded. We agree to stop raiding each other, and we agree to share what little magic we have. On the 6th day, we sign the pact. It's a roll of parchment, sealed with the wolf head of my house and the snarling wolf of the Green Horde. Now we are allies, united against the growing darkness. But there are rumblings among my men. Some are uncomfortable with our new ally. The orcs, of course, feel the same. One evening, I find Tareg and Gruk by the river bank. On the opposite bank, a group of young orcs and men are playing a game. How does one become allies with an orc? Tareg asks gruffly. By playing childish games. Games, Gruk says, are how we settled many disputes in the old days. Sometimes there is more to be learned from a game than from a battle. Are you saying we should trust orcs? Are you saying we shouldn't trust orcs? I am saying, Gruck says, that even sworn enemies can find common ground, even in a game. Turog shakes his head. Some things never change. I smile. Well, then perhaps some things should remain the same. Turog shrugs. True enough. Here's to hoping that whatever happens, we don't find out the hard way. From the opposite bank, we hear laughter and shouts of joy, the noise of children playing, the tentative peace between humans and orcs, the shared joy of a simple game. It's a small thing, but in the grand scheme of things, perhaps one of the most important things that has happened. So, we've talked about food, we've talked about games, we've talked about weather. What else do we know about what might have been happening in the lives of the Wampanoag people in the year 1621? Well, let's talk about Chapter 11, Wampanoag. Now, I'm gonna be real with you guys for a hot second. There is no way to talk about Wampanoag culture that does begin with the caveat that there is no singular Wampanoag culture. The term Wampanoag itself means people of the dawn or people of the first light in their own language, and it's a broad term that encompasses many different tribes and nations throughout southern New England, basically Long Island all the way up through Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and into Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. In fact, when Massasoit reached out to the Pilgrims in 1620, he was unjust speaking for himself, but for at least 36 different chiefdoms and thousands of people. But since this is a story about Thanksgiving, that's the culture I'll be talking about today. The Wampanoag people were agriculturalists who grew corn, squash, and beans, supplemented by hunting and fishing. They lived in permanent villages and followed what we would call a seasonal round, spending summers along the coast, where they could gather shellfish and visit other Wampanoag bands, and then returning to their home villages in the fall to plant the Three Sisters. Religion was also a big part of life. Unlike the more animistic beliefs of the tribes to the north, the Wampanoag had a sky god named Kainakut, the Great Spirit, who was the supreme being above all. He created the world and everything in it, and kept track of human behavior. His wife, Tabu, or sometimes Ozimat, was the earth, who nurtured living things. Together they had 4 sons. Kitchet, the eldest, was the sun. Pokon was the moon. Another son became the master of birds, teaching them to fly and speak. And lastly, one of the sons became the lord of the seas, given dominion over fish and whales. These 4 brothers were responsible for maintaining the world, keeping it in balance, and so they were often called upon in prayers and rituals. Additionally, every animal, tree, hill, and stream had a spirit in it, and some places were considered sacred. Dreams were important as well, and shamans, or medicine men, played an integral role in the community. They used herbalism, charms, and prayers to treat illnesses and injuries, and because of their ability to control the spiritual world, they held a great deal of power and influence. Finally, the Wampanoag believed in an afterlife. It was located in the west, across the great waters, and it was inhabited by the souls of those who had died. Those who died in infancy went straight there, as did those who died violent or unnatural deaths. The souls of the elderly who had lived good lives would journey to the west after their bodies had served them well for many winters. And now, dear viewer, I think it's time for us to get into the meat and potatoes of today's video. How might the Wampanoag people have viewed this event that we now call Thanksgiving? Now, I know you're thinking, didn't they hate the Pilgrims? Didn't they try to kill them? Yes, of course they did. And we'll get into that right after we talk about the fact that most likely they wouldn't have called this event Thanksgiving. Why? Because Thanksgiving wasn't a once-a-year celebration for the Wampanoag people. Instead, it was a general attitude of giving thanks, and they gave thanks every day, multiple times a day, for the sun, the moon, the earth, the water, the deer, the fish, the clams, the corn, the beans, the squash, the warm fire, full belly, everything. But there were also more formal occasions where giving thanks took place. When the seasons changed, for example, there were celebrations. Spring was a time for giving thanks for the return of the birds, and the blooming of the flowers, and the planting of the corn. Summer was a time for giving thanks for the bounty of the sea and the bounty of the land. And fall was a time for giving thanks for the harvest. These celebrations involved feasting, dancing, games, and ceremonies. There might have been a grand council where leaders from neighboring villages came together to smoke pipes and make treaties. There might have been contests like wrestling matches, running races, or shooting competitions. There might have been traditional foods like succotash and pumpkin and cranberry dishes. And of course, there would have been 3 sisters planted for the following spring, ensuring the continuation of the Wampanoag people. So if this 3-day feast with the Pilgrims happened in the midst of autumn, it would have fit right in with these other celebrations of the season. And that seems to be the way the Wampanoag viewed it, too. When Elder William Apes wrote his 1834 book, The Indian in America, he remembered these kinds of harvest celebrations. He said that in his youth, the natives about him celebrated the new year with a feast of venison, fish, corn, bread, and other good things, and spent 3 days in eating, drinking, and dancing. So we can assume that what we're remembering as Thanksgiving was just another celebration of the season. That being said, we also have to remember that this was a very difficult time for the Wampanoag. The previous summer, there had been a smallpox epidemic that killed hundreds of them. Their population wouldn't recover for decades. And here were these outsiders, the Pilgrims, who had brought the disease with them, taking up space on their land, trying to convert them to Christianity. And yet they still participated in this 3-day feast. So why? Well, there are 2 answers for that. The first is practicality. If the Wampanoag refused to participate in this feast, they would lose valuable trading partners. The Pilgrims, while not great farmers, were excellent woodsmen. They had axes that allowed them to fell trees much faster than the Wampanoag could. They also had metal tools that would help with planting and hunting, and they traded iron for the Wampanoag's stone tools, hoes, and arrowheads. And this trade was essential because of the depopulation from smallpox. There simply weren't enough people to go around to do all the necessary work. But beyond practicality, there was also ideology. The Wampanoag understood reciprocity and saw the value in helping others. They believed that if you gave something, you had to receive something in return. And what better way to establish a relationship with these strange newcomers than by participating in a ritual that both cultures valued? Giving thanks for the harvest was universal. And so by participating in this feast, the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims shared something in common. They even taught each other new foods and preparation methods. And for 3 days, at least, they had something to be thankful for. Sadly, these peaceful relations wouldn't last. The Pilgrims broke treaty after treaty. They encroached on Wampanoag lands. They stole their resources and refused to give anything in return. They enslaved and murdered them. They brought diseases that devastated their populations. And eventually they tried to force them off their lands altogether. But during those first 3 days in October of 1621, there was peace between them. And that's worth giving thanks for. Speaking of things that are worth giving thanks for, I'd like to take a moment to thank my supporters. Their generosity and love allow me to bring you guys these videos every week, and I really do appreciate it. And if you want to join their ranks, you can head on over to our support page and sign up today. Until next time, stay native. Welcome to Chapter 12 of our Pilgrim's Progress series. Join us for 11 more episodes as we follow Christian pilgrims on their journey to the Celestial City. But first, let's take a look at this week's sponsor. In addition to being the worst year in living memory, 2020 has been an expensive year for many families. Thanks to COVID, my family has had to replace computers, phones, headphones, and controllers like every month since last spring. And it's hard to keep track of which device belongs to who when everyone in the house is working from home, doing school, and playing games. That's why I was thrilled to hear about this week's sponsor, Frame.io. Frame.io helps you manage all your subscriptions in one place. You can easily see what each person in your household is subscribed to, so you do want to feel surprised by charges you do want to recognize. My wife and kids have their own Frame accounts so that they can choose what streaming services we have at any given time. It's great for my son to be able to choose between Disney Plus and Nickelodeon without me having to pay for both. You can also turn off automatic renewals if you want to cancel a subscription or rotate services each month to save money. As we gear up for Black Friday, Frame.io will help you avoid signing up for another service you'll never use. I'm excited to check out Frame.io's new feature that lets you earn cash back when you sign up for new services through Frame.io. Some services offer cash back automatically, and others you have to opt into. All the cash back goes directly into your Frame.io account where you can save it or spend it on gift cards. So visit Frame.io today and gain control of your finances this new year. The first 100 people to sign up with my link will get $10 of free cash back. Thanks again to Frame.io for sponsoring this episode. Now back to the show. Our series on Pilgrim's Progress continues with a look at Chapter 12. This is the first chapter in Part 2 of Pilgrim's Progress, and as we saw last week, Christian has now reached the end of his journey. He's standing outside the celestial gate ready to enter the city. But before he can pass through the gate, he has to participate in a feast with all the other pilgrims. Now feasts are always good, especially in stories like this. When you see a group of pilgrims celebrating with a big meal, you know things are going well. In Christian's story, the feast signals that his long and difficult journey is finally over. But feasts are dangerous for us. We tend to associate feasting with the gross and sensual pleasures of eating, drinking, and merriment, which is a far cry from the image of the pilgrim as someone who is supposed to be walking the path of holiness. Bunyan wrote Pilgrim's Progress in 1678, and at the time, there was a lot of talk about the English people indulging too much in feasting and drinking, which led to drunkenness and debauchery. So Bunyan took pains to explain how this particular feast fit into the Christian worldview. And to do that, we have to turn to the book of Revelation. As John writes in Revelation 19, "There was a great multitude in heaven, and I heard the voice of many waters and of loud voices saying, Alleluia, for the Lord God omnipotent reigns. Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready." Then a voice came out of the temple, saying, "Come out of her, my people, that you may not receive her plagues in your sight." The main character in Revelation is not John himself, but the Lamb. This Lamb represents Jesus, who is often portrayed as a lamb in the book of Revelation. Jesus was sacrificed to atone for the sins of humanity, just as a lamb was sacrificed in the Old Testament to atone for the sins of the Israelites. But in this vision, John sees Jesus alive after his crucifixion. And this signals God's final victory over death, sin, and the devil. And John describes this victory with wedding imagery. Jesus is the groom, and the church is his bride. To understand the imagery here, we need to go back to the creation account in Genesis. In Genesis 2, the garden is described as a place of gardens and a paradise, where there are rivers flowing out from Eden to water it. And it says that the ground was well watered, causing the garden to flourish. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed, and out of the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, and good for food. The tree of life was in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This imagery is important because in this vision, John is looking down upon the garden from above. Remember, John is describing something that he saw in a vision. And what he sees is that everything is flourishing and producing fruit. But what really catches his attention are the trees. There are two trees in the middle of the garden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life appears elsewhere in Scripture. Like in Exodus 23 verse 33, "I will plant them in the land and no longer be plucked up from the land that I have made them dwell in. Yes, I will have mercy on them and have compassion on them and the offspring of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. For I will restore their fortunes and have mercy on them." Here, God tells Moses that he will plant the nation of Israel in the land of Canaan, and he compares those people to a tree that can't be pulled up. This language comes from the creation account in Genesis 2, and it signifies that these people are God's property, and that God is responsible for caring for them. But there's another tree in the middle of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this tree serves as a constant reminder of humanity's fall into sin. If the tree of life symbolizes God's people, then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil symbolizes sin. And what John sees in this vision is that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is gone. So what does this mean? What John saw in his vision was the removal of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This means that Adam and Eve's sin has been forgiven, and that future for God's people doesn't involve living under the curse of the fall. Instead, it means that God's people can flourish and bear fruit and enjoy blessings, and still be very close to God. So what does this mean for Christian and the other pilgrims? Just as John saw the removal of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Christian and the other pilgrims are experiencing the removal of the tree of sin in their lives. Christian isn't perfect, but he's no longer under the penalty of sin. His sin has been forgiven, and he knows that he will inherit the kingdom of heaven. This feast celebrates this reality. You see, there's a misunderstanding in the modern church about what forgiveness is. Many Christians believe that God forgives them so that they won't go to hell. And while that's true, it's only part of the picture. To truly understand what it means to be forgiven, we have to look at the original language. The word forgive in English comes from the Latin word, which means to make an exchange. And in Latin, that word is to forgive. To forgive is to make an exchange. And the exchange is that God forgets your sin and puts it on Jesus. So not only does your punishment go away, but your record of sin goes away as well. When we understand what it means to be forgiven, we can live fearless in our faith, knowing that nothing can separate us from God's love. As Paul wrote in Romans 8, "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. For the law of the Spirit of life has set you free from the law of sin and death." What the law could not do in that it was weak, through the flesh, God did. Condemnation, therefore, has come upon sin and death by the flesh, much more upon him who has not seen the law. For we know that under the law old things have passed away. Behold, new things I have declared, and behold, they are coming. As for those things which were old, they are vanished away. Pilgrims are people who have experienced God's forgiveness. They know that their sins have been washed away, and they know that they are going to heaven. The feast is a celebration of that fact, but there's more. Not only do pilgrims know that they are forgiven, they also know that God has a plan for their lives. As we read in Isaiah 46, "My prophecy shall have a sure target. I will also make it clear in the future. Do not waver from what I have set forth, for I am near to save you, declares the Lord." These people are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So the feast is a celebration of God's faithfulness. Pilgrims are people who have seen God's hand moving in their lives. They've seen God open doors and make paths and bring people together. They know that God keeps his promises, and they celebrate that fact with a feast. The feast is also a celebration of God's power. As we read in Nehemiah 9, "You alone have done all this for us and for us alone. And we have not dealt with you according to your righteousness, for we have not fulfilled your laws and your commandments. Yet you have had mercy on us and have saved us according to your abundant mercies." Pilgrims are people who have seen God work in their lives and against all odds. They know that God is more than able to deliver them from their circumstances, and they celebrate that fact with a feast. Finally, the feast is a celebration of God's presence. As we read in Psalms, "Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the chief of all gods. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker." Throughout the Bible, God's people celebrate his presence among them. When God delivered Israel from Egypt, they celebrated with a Passover meal. When Joshua led Israel into the Promised Land, they celebrated with a feast at Gilgal. And when the tabernacle was finished, the entire community of Israel celebrated with a feast. Why? Because God promised to meet with them there. Christian and the other pilgrims aren't celebrating by themselves. They're celebrating with other believers, and they know that God is right in the middle of them. In addition to these celebrations, there are a few entries in Christian's journal that shed light on how he viewed this feast, and the first entry is dated December 1647. Christian writes, "This day my wife, children, and I did solemnize the passing of my former life, before I knew Christ, and the entering into the state of grace, by the knowledge of our justification by faith and reconciliation to God, by reading of Scripture, prayer, singing, and thanksgiving." This entry reveals how Christian viewed the feast. It wasn't just an excuse to eat good food and drink strong drink, it was an opportunity for spiritual reflection. For Christian, this feast wasn't just about food, it was about God. It was a chance for him to reflect on how far he'd come, and to thank God for bringing him to this point. Another entry sheds light on how Christian and the other pilgrims viewed their survival. It was God's providence. For example, in one entry, Christian writes, "Since I have been in this place of safety, I have met with some professors who have given me some light in things that before were dark to me, and I do bless God for them, but more for that love which they showed to me, in calling upon me frequently to eat and drink, and for that they spared not to furnish me with necessaries fitting for my weak body, whilst I was sick, and continue it so careful still." Christian didn't survive the journey by luck or happenstance, he survived because God was with him, and he recognizes that God worked through other people to sustain him on his journey. And finally, we have one last entry that reads, "Last night being Christmas Day, We spent it in the most blessed manner, having the best discourse that ever we had in all our pilgrimage together, and that was about the providence of God towards us in our coming over, and the comfortable entertainment we had in our several callings since we came into England. Yea, and that not only in outward things, but inward comforts also. Here, Christian and the pilgrims are looking back on their journey, and they couldn't help but notice God's hand moving in their lives. Every step of the way, Christian is overwhelmed with gratitude for the way that God cared for him, and he realizes that everything that happened to him was purposeful and meaningful. As we think about the feast, let's remember that pilgrims aren't people who strive to attain God's favor. They are people who have received God's favor. They know that they are forgiven, that they are adopted into God's family, and that they have a bright future in God's presence. The feast is a celebration of that reality. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to our channel to get more videos from us. Also, don't forget to check out our site for additional articles and resources related to this topic. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. I am gone, do something different for chapter 13. We are gone, talk about the legacy of 1621. But instead of trying to present some kind of comprehensive history of everything that happened in 1621, which is basically impossible because there's so much that happened in 1621, I want to talk about how the story of 1621 has been told and retold over the centuries. I want to focus on one particular story from 1621, the story of the first Thanksgiving feast, and I want to talk about how that story was born and how it became the story that we know today. This is going to be a little bit different than normal. I hope you like it. Let me know in the comments what you think, and let's get into chapter 13. It is November 1621. You've been here before. You've heard this story before. The Pilgrims have just arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, after a perilous journey across the ocean and a brutal winter in which more than half of them died. They are celebrating their first harvest feast with the local indigenous people. There were 53 surviving pilgrims and 90 members of the Wampanoag tribe who participated in this 3-day feast. They ate wildfowl and fish and venison, which was provided by the indigenous people. They ate corn, pumpkins, squash, beans, and other foods that the pilgrims had planted. And after 3 days of eating and celebration, the pilgrims decided that they were gone, start a tradition. And they would celebrate this day of giving thanks every year. And that's why we celebrate Thanksgiving every year. If you're new here, welcome. I am your host, and this is the 1621 Project, where I am telling the story of the Mayflower and the first Thanksgiving year by year. Now, if you've watched the videos in order, then you know that that story isn't exactly true. In fact, there were no Mayflower passengers at this feast. The Mayflower didn't arrive until December of 1620, and the first Thanksgiving was celebrated until 1623. But still, it's a good story, right? A story of pilgrims and Indians coming together in peace and friendship to celebrate the bounty of the New World. That sounds great. Let's all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Except the problem is that that's not really what happened either. I mean, the basic bones of the story are correct. There was a harvest feast in Plymouth in 1621, and there were probably around 50 to 100 indigenous people from the Wampanoag tribe who participated in it. But the details of the story, the details that have become so ingrained in our national consciousness, those details weren't really written down until almost 200 years after the feast actually took place. In 1850, a man named Alexander Young wrote a story called The First Thanksgiving. It was published in a popular magazine of the time called The Knickerbocker, and in this story, Young imagined what it must have been like to be at that first Thanksgiving feast. He wrote, "The scene now is one of unmingled joy. All care and anxiety are forgotten. The season of plenty is come, and the hearts of the colonists and their Indian friends are light and gay as the song of the robin or the lark." Young went on to describe the festivities of the 3-day feast, the parades and games and bonfires and fireworks and everything. And he ended the story with a reenactment of the prayer that Edward Winslow supposedly gave at the first Thanksgiving. Young's story was wildly popular when it was published. It was reprinted dozens of times in newspapers and magazines and school books throughout the 19th century, and it formed the basis for the Thanksgiving story that most Americans know today. There's just one small problem. Almost none of it is true. We don't know what the first Thanksgiving looked like. There were no written accounts from any pilgrim describing what happened. The only source we have is a one-sentence reference in a letter that Edward Winslow wrote to a friend back in England, and in that letter, Winslow simply stated that they had a 3-day feast and invited the neighboring tribes to participate. There's nothing about parades or games or bonfires or fireworks or any of the other things that Alexander Young described in his story. So where did that stuff come from? Well, some of it came from other stories that were being told about the Pilgrims at the time. Stories like The Thanksgiving of the Pilgrims by Lydia Maria Child, which was published in 1837. In that story, Child described the Pilgrims marching in a parade to the top of Coles Hill to give thanks to God for their deliverance from the perils of the sea, and she also talked about them releasing doves and balloons into the air and having a huge bonfire to celebrate. None of that happened at the 1621 feast, but it sounded pretty cool, so Young probably borrowed it from Child's story and added it to his version. But a lot of the details in Young's story also came from another source, a book called The History of New England by George Vescovo, and while Vespers was writing a serious historical account of the colonial era, he also wove a lot of fanciful detail into his book. For example, he described an incident that allegedly happened during the first Thanksgiving feast. Supposedly, one of the pilgrims, John Alden, was sitting next to a beautiful Native American woman named Priscilla Mullins, and when Alden turned to talk to her, sparks flew and they fell in love. Sparks may have indeed flown, but there's no evidence that this story is true. Vespers got the idea from an 1824 book called The New England Galaxy, which published a fictionalized account of the meeting between Alden and Priscilla. These details, these romantic notions of pilgrims and Native Americans coming together in peace and friendship, they've been part of our national consciousness for hundreds of years. We see it in paintings like The First Thanksgiving by Jenny M. Atwater. Atwater's painting was completed in 1859, just after Alexander Young's story was published, and it shows a group of stern-faced pilgrims sitting at a table with equally stern-faced Native Americans. But even though the faces are stern, the overall message of the painting is clear. The pilgrims and the Native Americans are friends. They're sharing a meal together. They're giving thanks together. And the painting reinforces the notion that the United States was founded on a spirit of cooperation between these two groups. But that's not really what happened. Not at that first Thanksgiving, and not in the decades that followed. As William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote in his journal, the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was complicated, and while there were times of cooperation and friendship, there were also times of conflict and distrust. One of the reasons that Massasoit and his warriors helped the Pilgrims in 1621 was that the English represented a potential ally against their enemies, the Narragansett. But within just a few years, the Pilgrims had broken that alliance and were fighting alongside the Narragansett against the Pequot. And as Bradford wrote, the land that the Pilgrims claimed was already occupied by the Wampanoag and other tribes, and they would continue to encroach on tribal lands throughout the 1620s and 1630s. The story of peaceful coexistence between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans was a myth that only became popular almost 200 years after the events of 1621. By that point, the relationship between colonists and Native Americans had deteriorated significantly. There were wars, and broken treaties, and broken alliances, and millions of acres of tribal land had been taken by European colonists. The Thanksgiving story, with its message of cooperation and friendship, it seemed to offer a better vision of the past, a vision that might have been more appealing in happier times, but certainly wasn't by the mid-19th century. Now, if you're watching this video on November, then you know that Thanksgiving is coming up. And if you're celebrating Thanksgiving this year, I hope you have a wonderful holiday with your family and friends. I hope you get to spend time with loved ones and eat delicious food, and I hope you take some time to reflect on all the things you have to be thankful for. Now, if you'd like to support the work that I do here, one of the best ways you can do that is by becoming a member on a website. Members get access to a monthly podcast, where I talk about topics related to the Mayflower and the early colonial period, and I release new episodes every single month. So if you'd like to learn more about those bonus podcasts, go ahead and check out the link in the description below. If you enjoyed this episode, then you'll probably enjoy the one that comes out next week, where I talk about what Edward Winslow's journal can teach us about the culture of Plymouth Colony. And if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe. And with that, I'll see you next week for Chapter 14. Well, now let's get to chapter 14 of our Thanksgiving storybook. And in this chapter, we will learn about the 19th century and how Thanksgiving became a national holiday. This is part 2. You can find part 1 down in the description, along with links to all of our other videos. So make sure to check them out after this one. But for now, let's go back to 1800s America. In the early days of the United States, each state had its own day of Thanksgiving, and they were often very different from each other. In some states, it was called Harvest Thanksgiving Day and celebrated the successful gathering of crops. Other states called it a day of Thanksgiving and prayer, or a day of Thanksgiving and praise. Some states chose a specific day in the fall, while others, like Massachusetts, celebrated it on the last Thursday in November. Since everyone had their own personal Thanksgiving celebration, there was no official federal holiday. Now, if you're re-asking yourself why we changed from celebrating Thanksgiving every year on a different day to always celebrating it on the same day every year, then you are going to love this story. See, during this time period, one woman was on a mission to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hale, and she was a magazine writer and editor. Now, she had a big dream of unifying the country through the celebration of a common holiday. She envisioned families across the nation coming together each year in the fall to share a large feast and giving thanks for their many blessings. To achieve her goal, she began writing letters to Congress every single year, pleading for a national Thanksgiving Day. She wrote to governors, senators, and presidents. For years, though Congress refused to set aside one specific day for people to celebrate Thanksgiving, they feared that establishing a national Thanksgiving Day would cause people to abandon their religious freedom, because the government was mandating one specific holiday. But Sarah did not give up. Finally, in 1850, after writing letter after letter for more than 30 years, her efforts paid off. President Millard Fillmore signed a law making the last Thursday in November a national holiday to be celebrated each and every year. At last, Thanksgiving was becoming a national holiday. But then the Civil War broke out, and it seemed like all hope of having a national holiday was lost again. The country was divided and no one could agree on anything. And so for several years during the Civil War, celebrations of Thanksgiving were put on hold. People did celebrate informally in some places, but Thanksgiving just wasn't the same without the entire country participating. Then came the year 1863. That year, President Abraham Lincoln announced that the last Thursday in November would be a national Thanksgiving Day. He proclaimed that the people of the United States should set aside that day to give thanks to Almighty God for the blessings of the year. And for the first time, the country came together to celebrate Thanksgiving as one. Following Lincoln's proclamation, each president after him continued to proclaim Thanksgiving as a national holiday. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, people really didn't feel very thankful. Times were hard, and the economy was in sharp decline. Many families struggled to afford a traditional Thanksgiving meal, which consisted of things like turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. So President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved Thanksgiving to the second-to-last Thursday in November. He wanted to give people an extra week to earn more money, so they could have a better Thanksgiving celebration. This change did help boost the economy a little bit, but people were still struggling. Also, many people thought that moving the date of Thanksgiving was a bad idea. For example, the head of the National Retail Dry Goods Association said that it was a very serious matter and that merchants everywhere would suffer if the date of Thanksgiving was changed. However, this change made Thanksgiving last longer, and many families enjoyed this extra holiday. So even though there were some complaints, most people agreed that having an extra day to celebrate Thanksgiving was a good thing. Finally, in 1941, Congress passed a law officially changing the date of Thanksgiving to the fourth Thursday in November. This way, the date of Thanksgiving would always be the same every single year. As the years went by, Thanksgiving grew into one of the biggest holidays of the year. But many people began to forget what Thanksgiving was really about. Stores started putting up Christmas displays right after Halloween. Football games and parades took center stage on Thanksgiving Day, and many people stopped taking time to give thanks for their blessings. Now, don't get me wrong, parades and football are great, but let's make sure that we remember the true meaning of Thanksgiving. After all, it is a time to show gratitude for all of the good things in our lives. It's a time to reflect on everything we have to be thankful for, and to remember those who have less, and show kindness and generosity. As author W.J. Cameron once wrote, Thanksgiving is a time to draw close the circle of family and friends. It is a time to give thanks to God for the gift of loved ones and to cherish their presence in our lives. So when you think about Thanksgiving, remember that it is much more than just a day off school and work. It's a time to come together with those you love and to remember all the blessings that you have been given throughout the year. So, to wrap things up here, the Thanksgiving celebration has come a long way since the Pilgrims and Native Americans shared a meal in 1621. What began as a small harvest festival has evolved into a major national holiday celebrated by millions of people around the world. From the Mayflower to President Abraham Lincoln and beyond, the history of Thanksgiving is filled with stories of gratitude, perseverance, and unity. And while Thanksgiving traditions may change over time, the spirit of the holiday remains the same, a time to give thanks for all the blessings in our lives. No matter how you choose to celebrate Thanksgiving, whether it's with a traditional feast, volunteering at a local food bank, or simply taking time to reflect on all you have to be grateful for, I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Speaking of wonderful, all right, let's play a quick game. I'm gonna leave for questions about what we learned in this video down in the description, and if you answer all 4 correctly, you will win this very special prize. Boom. Okay, now, it's time for your assignment. Over in the Storybook app, you can read all about the Wampanoag tribe and learn how they lived in the New World. To get started, click the link down in the description, or scan this very handy-dandy QR code. If you want to keep watching, click the video on screen now to continue on in the series, or click the video over here to watch another one of my favorite videos. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye. So we're going to circle back now to where we started, which was that quiet autumn morning. It is still that quiet autumn morning, but it's morning somewhere else now, isn't it? The world has turned, the earth has turned, and we find ourselves at the end of this book. We find ourselves at the end of this particular journey. A journey we began on an ordinary day just a few months ago. I don't know what you were doing on that first day of January, but I do know that whatever you were doing, whatever you had planned, something came along and derailed those plans. Something came along and made you stop. You stopped and you listened. You listened to the words of an old woman who was telling stories about her life. Stories about survival and determination and hope. Stories about family and friends and laughter. Stories about love and loss and faith. You sat with me around a fire as the snow fell outside, and we talked about the kinds of things that really matter in life, the big questions, the deepest fears, the quietest hopes. We talked about death and legacy and how our lives might make a difference in the world. And then, something remarkable happened. As I told these stories, I felt myself becoming younger. That's not possible, is it? But it did happen. Not because the snow was falling or the fire was burning, but because of who was listening, because of your willingness to sit with me and talk about things that mattered, things that transcended age or circumstance or anything else. We talked about everything and nothing, about the shape of clouds and the taste of tea, about the resilience of the human spirit and the power of forgiveness. We talked about the things that have always mattered and will always matter, the things that connect us all as human beings, regardless of where we live or what we do or when we live. And as we talked, I realized that we were talking about more than just the stories I was telling. We were talking about the stories that have been told for thousands of years, the stories that are older than any of us, and yet somehow always new. The stories that give meaning to our lives and help us to understand who we are and why we're here. Stories like the story of creation, the story of the fall, the story of redemption. Stories like the story of the Good Samaritan, the story of David and Goliath, the story of the prodigal son. Stories like the story of Ruth, the story of Esther, the story of Joseph. Stories of courage and faith, stories of hope and love, stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. Stories that have shaped civilizations and inspired revolutions, stories that have given people strength in times of trouble and shown them the way through darkness. The great thing about stories is that they never get old. They may be ancient, but they're never dated. They may be traditional, but they're never outmoded. They may be timeless, but they're never irrelevant. Stories are the way we make sense of the world. They're the way we pass on our culture and values. They're the way we connect with each other and understand each other. And so, as I've sat around the fire and told you these stories, I haven't just been telling you stories. I've been reminding you of the things that have always mattered and will always matter. I've been reminding you of the things that connect us all and make us one. I've been reminding you of the things that give life meaning and hope in the midst of despair. We've talked about gratitude, gratitude for the gift of life, for the beauty of the world, for the love of family and friends. We've talked about resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity, to keep going when things are tough, to never give up. We've talked about community, the importance of belonging, of being part of something bigger than ourselves. We've talked about hope, the belief that things will get better, that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that no matter how dark it gets, it can't get any darker. And we've talked about faith, the kind of faith that moves mountains, that makes the impossible possible, that turns despair into hope, fear into courage, doubt into certainty. These are the things that have always mattered and will always matter. These are the things that connect us all. These are the things that give life meaning. As we come to the end of this journey, I want you to take these things with you. I want you to hold on to them and let them guide you, let them comfort you, let them strengthen you. Now, when you look back over your own life, what are the moments that stand out the most? What are the moments that have shaped who you are today? What are the moments that have taught you the most? For me, they're the quiet moments, the moments when I've been alone with my thoughts or with God, when I've been able to reflect on my life and the things that really matter. They're the moments when I've been grateful for something, when I've been thankful for the gift of life, for the beauty of the world, for the love of family and friends. They're the moments when I've been resilient, when I've been able to bounce back from adversity, to keep going when things are tough, to never give up. They're the moments when I've been part of a community, when I've been part of something bigger than myself, when I've felt the support of others, when I've been able to give back. They're the moments when I've had hope, when I've believed that things will get better, that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that no matter how dark it gets, it can't get any darker. They're the moments when I've had faith, when I've trusted in a power greater than myself, when I've known that I'm not alone, that someone is with me every step of the way. These are the moments that have shaped me. These are the moments that have made me who I am. So as we come to the end of this journey, I want you to think about your own story, about the moments that have shaped you, about the moments that have taught you the most. I want you to hold on to those moments and let them guide you, let them comfort you, let them strengthen you. And I want you to remember that you're not alone. You're part of a community of people who are going through the same things you are, who have the same hopes and dreams you have, who have the same fears and struggles you have. You're part of a community that has been with you since the beginning, that will be with you until the end, that will be with you for all eternity. So go out into the world today and be thankful. Be thankful for the gift of life, for the beauty of the world, for the love of family and friends. Be thankful for the moments that have shaped you, that have taught you the most. Be thankful for the community that has been with you since the beginning. And most of all, be thankful for God's love. A love that is everlasting, a love that is unconditional, a love that is eternal. Go out into the world today and be grateful. Be grateful for everything you have, for everything you are, for everything you hope to be. Be grateful and give thanks to God, for in the end, that is all that will matter. And now we come to the end of this story. And like all stories, there's a bit of a lull now. The music fades, the lights dim, the audience applauds. It's over. But then, and only then, do you realize that the story isn't really over, it's just begun. You see, stories live on after they've been told. They echo in our hearts and minds long after the last word has been spoken. They become part of us. They shape us. They mold us. They make us who we are. And so it is with this story. It's not just a story you read a while ago. It's a story that's now a part of you. It's a story that will stay with you for the rest of your life. It's a story that will remind you of the things that really matter. It's a story that will give you strength in times of trouble, that will show you the way through darkness, that will lead you to hope, that will bring you home. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for listening to these stories. Thank you for sharing them with others. And above all, thank you for living your story. May it be a story that brings you joy and laughter, hope and faith, love and peace. And may it be a story that you tell with a smile, knowing that no matter what happens, you'll be okay. Because the story isn't over, it's just begun.